These are the Lewis LHP Plus U4 brakes. Now I know Lewis is pretty new to the game and there's been a bit of controversy. I'm not going to go through all of that because you should go watch Dale's video. He's done a way better video explaining all the details and history of Lewis, and you can go watch that. I'll link it down in the description or something. If you want to know more about Lewis and the controversy and all that, just go watch that video. Today's video is just going to be focused on these brakes, how I liked them, and how they performed. Now, if you haven't watched that video and you're not familiar with Lewis at all, they are a new Chinese brake manufacturer, and yeah, you might recognize these brakes. They do look a little familiar, but they are quite different from the brakes that they're inspired from, the Trick Stuff Maximas. Lewis has been making a ton of different brakes very quickly lately. There's the LHP Plus, and it comes in the U4 and I think the S4 versions. There's the LHTs, as well as the LH4s. Not to mention that these are the axial lever brakes. There's also the radial lever brakes. There's a lot of overlap. So I think the LHT, the LHP, and the LH4 are all kind of aimed at a similar demographic, that is downhill, enduro, big braking bikes. The difference between them is basically the LH4 is kind of their introduction to these bigger brakes. They're not too fancy. They've got a 14 mil and a 17 mil set of pistons, and yeah, that's kind of your Maxima-esque brake. Then we get to the LHT brakes that has, of course, titanium hardware. That's what the T stands for. The calipers also have two sets of 17 mil pistons, and the coolest thing is that they have a leverage ratio adjust. Now, the LHP brakes, you know, they're pretty similar actually. They're very similar to the LHT. They also have a leverage ratio adjust, and we'll get to that in a second. A lot of overlap between the LHG and the LHP, but kind of just some minor revisions in the caliper and the lever. But let's get to the brake I've actually been riding. This is the Lewis LHP Plus U4 brake, and the U4 is the one with the bigger pistons. It's two sets of 17 mil pistons. And maybe I'll just start all my reviews the way I started my Maven brake review. I'll just say it, I like them. They're good brakes, and let's go through why. Now let's start up here with the lever. Now, of course, it looks pretty familiar, but it has a few tricks up its sleeve, which I wish Trick Stuff would actually implement. So first of all, it's an all metal lever, and it feels quite solid, feels pretty premium. Not the most premium brake I've ever felt. I think that would go to something like those titanium 3D printed Piccolas, I think they're called. Those just feel insanely premium and also cost insane amount. These are much more reasonably priced, and they feel at least as premium, if not more, than say something like the XT or the Code RSC, or even the Maven. I would say they do have quite a bit more bling factor than those brakes though, so we'll give them that. So there is the reach adjust, which you just twiddle this knob here and it moves how far the lever is away from the grip. But within this reach adjust, we have a little 2mm Allen key, which adjusts the bite point. Now it uses this very fiddly, tiny little 2mm Allen key nub. But yeah, you get it in there, you tighten it up, and that just reduces how much throw there is in the lever. So reach and bite point adjust, those are pretty common adjustments. Although for some reason, bite point adjust isn't that common. I wish it was on every brake, and I'm very happy to see it on this brake. But what this brake has, which I've never seen on any other brake, is an adjuster to adjust the leverage ratio of the lever. So by getting in here with two tiny 1.5mm Allen keys, which I desperately wish they would figure out a different way to tighten down this knob. So you get your Allen key in there, you loosen it off, you turn this knob here, and it actually sort of rotates the whole lever assembly here and gives you different leverage ratios. And I've played with basically all the settings. I mean, there's infinite amount of settings, but I've kind of played with them at all the extremes. And honestly, it makes quite a big difference. You can make your brakes feel very different. And basically what that boils down to is, say you like a Shimano-esque brake feel, you can dial the leverage ratio into that, get that firmer bite point, or maybe you want a lot of modulation. You can twiddle the leverage ratio and move it over into the sort of lots of modulation position. And yeah, it makes a big difference. Really, how fast, how much the brake ramps up in power is affected a lot by twiddling this knob. Now, it's been really cool to play with it and see where I want to keep it, but I don't think it's something that I would be adjusting all that often. I don't really change my mind on how I like my brakes to feel in general, at least not that much, not to the degree I need to adjust sort of the leverage ratio of the lever itself. So I think it's cool. I think it's really awesome that they're innovating something that nobody else is doing and they're giving it a go. But at the same time, I played with it until I found the settings that I did like, and I've kind of set it and forget it. So I have the brake set up for basically the quickest bite point, so it ramps up in power as quickly as possible. And I've also got the bite point screwed all the way in, just so I have the shortest amount of throw. But there's still a decent amount of throw in the lever. Not a ton, nothing too crazy, but yeah, it's definitely not a short throw lever. And then speaking of how this lever feels, it feels probably Shimano-esque. Not as difficult to pull as, say, the Mavens, but more kind of like the Shimanos, but not nearly as light as something like the Hayes. And that's just in the dead stroke. The actual feel of the lever, you know, against your skin or your gloves or what have you, it's a little smooth. I actually wish they would put just a little bit of, you know, ridging or holes or something in here just to give a little bit more grip. I've been riding without gloves lately, and yeah, sometimes I get sweaty and it gets very slippery between my fingers and this polished aluminum, this polished metal here. So yeah, I wish there was just a little bit more grip in there. I already mentioned this, but another complaint is the very tiny 1.5 mil Allen keys that they use to tighten down the leverage ratio adjust. The leverage ratio adjust is also not marked, so I figured out kind of what setting I like, but I've got to go by feel. Like there's nothing for me to look at and say like, oh, I like setting 4 or something like that. You just got to kind of keep feeling and then feel both brakes and go, okay, I think they're both about the same, and then tighten them down quick. I've also found that even though I tighten them down sometimes, and there's 2 little bolts in there, sometimes they'll come loose. And yeah, if you don't have those bolts tightened down, the leverage ratio adjust will rotate on you. I'd also say there's so many settings in the lever. There's actually quite a few that are just unusable. If you dial the bite point all the way out and you set your leverage ratio, you know, to, so there's lots of throw, you know, it's like low leverage or high leverage, whichever one. You could make it so there's just so much throw in the lever, you would have to have it miles away to actually actuate the brake. And so, yeah, I think Lewis could take a little bit more time and dial in sort of a set of useful settings, a range of useful settings. I mean, it's not really a problem or anything, you just won't use those settings. These are also mineral oil brakes, and I find the bleed process generally pretty straightforward. It's a very similar process to, say, Shimano. You can do the bleed cup. You can even do just a top lever bleed here, but they have an anti-leak system in these brakes, which is actually pretty nice. It's got a reusable olive and a pretty nice little barb, but the reusable olive is cool where, yeah, sometimes you're swapping brakes around or you need to, you know, run the brake hose through the frame, having to snip it and redo the olive and the barb all the time when you're switching brakes or you've got a broken lever or whatever it might be. Yeah, it can get kind of annoying. It's nice to just be able to pop it off, run the brake through the frame, pop it back on, and yeah, you're just up and going way more quick and you don't need to waste an olive. But speaking of a bleed, I have had a bit of inconsistency with these brakes. They don't pump up, not in the same way that you get those weird pumping issues with Shimano where you kind of have no brake and you got to pump them back up. It seems as though when I'm riding these brakes, and especially on bigger descents, they will slowly get firmer and firmer. They actually start to feel better and better until I guess maybe they cool down, or yeah, you pump them a few more times after your ride. Then they go back to being a bit more squishy, a bit more like Trick Stuff. If you've ever felt the Trick Stuff, it has a very squishy bite point feel to it. It's not super firm. Yeah, so right now, yeah, it feels there's a little bit of squish there, but after a big long descent, that'll firm up, and even the bite point, you know, where it is will shorten up. The throw will shorten. So yeah, not a huge issue. You basically, it's really easy to compensate for because it's not, you know, it's not making a huge difference, but it's just something I have noticed. And yeah, I'm not a brake engineer. I have no idea why that happens, but yeah, I think they'll address that hopefully in future iterations of this brake. Moving on to the caliper, I guess calipers are kind of a little more boring. Yeah, it's a pretty standard caliper, except they do have these metal fins. Now in this iteration of the brake, in this caliper, the fins don't come out of the caliper without separating the two halves. Yeah, which is a bit annoying, but I believe they've actually made a running change and the fins now just come out. The fins are very similar to what you would see on those Shimano brake pads. I can't remember what they're called now. But yeah, they're supposed to be for cooling down the brake pads. I haven't had tons of heat issue with my brakes. I can think of maybe one time in the last 6 years, and I was riding a huge descent where I actually had some brake fade that was really noticeable. So yeah, I could take it or leave it with the fins. They look cool though. That being said, when you first get these brakes and you shake the caliper with the fins, They're kind of just loose in there. They can't come out, but they are kind of loosely sitting in the caliper. And yeah, you shake it and you're like, oh wow, that's really loud. At first I was really worried that my bike was now going to be super loud and like a shopping cart. But in general, I'd say I can't really hear it shaking around back there once everything's installed. That being said, it's not totally silent. Every now and then I hear some rattling up in the front. And I mean, that doesn't help because I've got this super quiet build that I've done, including the Onyx silent hub. So I'm just hyper aware of any noise on my bike. But yeah, a little bit of rattle in there, something to keep in mind. And like I said, I think future iterations now have fins that you can take out. And I think if I had that, I would just take the fins out. And other than that, they use the Hope pad standard. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but a pretty easy to find brake pad, and yeah, no complaints with those. Okay, that's enough sort of housekeeping about the brakes. Let's talk about how they actually feel to ride. The top end power, so when I'm basically squeezing as hard as I can, I'm doing those big slaps and squamish, is very good. Totally usable for someone like me who is quite heavy. I would ride these on an e-bike, no problem. I think it's a little bit less than, say, the Mavens. I think I have to squeeze these a little bit harder to slow down on, again, those big slabs. But you know what? It's like 95% of the way there. And I would place that top end power more than my XTs, I think, and definitely more than something like the Code RSCs. Okay, but now let's talk about modulation. Now that's a bit of a tricky one. Dale and I were actually discussing this by what do we mean by good modulation or more modulation? I think the conclusion we've come to, Dale is going to go for the specific route where he talks about more or less modulation. That is how sort of flat the curve of lever pull to brake power applied is. So a flatter curve is a lot of modulation, so you've got a lot of swing along the power, whereas I kind of like to talk about, the vibes. You know, I talk about good and bad modulation. I just go with how well can I modulate the brake. And between the two of us, hopefully get a pretty good idea what brakes are gonna feel like. So if we're going off chunky vibes, there's this, you know, ladder bridge that I mentioned in my Maven review that I kind of use to benchmark how modulating a brake feels. And these brakes, they have very good modulation. Say with a brake like the Mavens or even like a Shimano, they will bite fast and they'll ramp up quite fast. And now in the case of the Mavens, that's helped me because I'm a heavier rider, and while I need a lot of braking force to, you know, say do a nose manual, a stoppie down something like that bridge, I gotta have a lot of force, you know, holding up all this mass. And with these brakes, it takes a bit more, so you've got to pull the lever, and it's a bit of a soft touch as the pads squish the disc. So as you pull the lever, it feels kind of soft, and you can kind of feather the brake, and then it feels pretty linear in sort of the mid-stroke of the brake, and then it ramps up very quick at the end there. And now, I can't really give you exact numbers, and I don't know if that would be that helpful if I told you like, oh, it's got this much torque at this position of the lever. But what I can tell you is that when I go to my bridge and I try to do my stoppies, yeah, I feel very confident just kind of going for it with these brakes. And yeah, I just don't have to think about the brake as much. I can really focus on the stoppie. And yeah, in my opinion, that means they have great modulation. If you've ever tried the TRPs, it's somewhat like that, except the TRPs don't ramp up. And so that was my problem with them. I would say the TRPs, for me, don't have good modulation. They have a lot of modulation, but they don't have good modulation. Because there's no final ramp up in power, I always was finding myself having to squeeze really hard, and it was so hard to kind of modulate my own sort of finger strength. Whereas with this, I can control the brake better. And so hopefully that'll make sense. And all that is to say, this is probably the best modulating brake I've tried so far. That is a brake where I can control the power the easiest, and I don't have to think about the brake. And so I think that's all my thoughts on these brakes. It's a very good brake with a good build. It's got great modulation and great top end power. It's got a few quirks dealing with the leverage ratio, getting the pump up and the bleed dealt with correctly, the fins rattling, things like that. It's a bit quirky, but if we get past that and, well, we get past the controversy, it's a great brake and I really like them. So if I missed anything or you have any questions about the brake, leave them down in the comments, and maybe I'll end with my official rankings of brakes I like at the end of every video here. So this is only the second brake I've reviewed so far, but I've got more coming in for review. And so the list would go something like this. I think in the #1 spot, I still have the Mavens. I think those are my favorite brake right now. These would be a close second, ignoring a few of the quirks, and maybe if we could dial up the power a little bit, I think they could overtake the Mavens. My third choice in brake would probably be something like the Shimano XT. Fourth, I'd probably go with something like TRP, and fifth, I would go with Code RSC. I have tried Maguras before, and I remember liking them, and I've got a set of Magura MT7s on the way, so keep an eye out for that review. Okay, that's it for real. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.